getting increasingly competitive.
I'm Isa Suarez in London, and this is CNN. High-stakes NATO summit this week, where the United States and its Western allies aim to ensure a united front against Russia. Can they do that? Well, I'm Becky Anderson. Hello and welcome back to Connect the World. That is what we will discuss this hour. From the UN to Brussels, world leaders are looking at ways to help Ukraine and punish Russia. US President Joe Biden on his way to NATO headquarters right now. The NATO chief says the alliance will increase its forces in the region. Have a listen.
I expect leaders will agree to strengthen NATO's posture in all domains, with major increases to our forces in the eastern part of the alliance, in Bulgaria, Hungary, Romania and Slovakia.
Well, the British Defence Ministry says Russian forces are now trying to surround Ukrainian troops in the east. You can see there on that map the Russians moving in from Kharkiv in the north and Mariupol in the south. And here's a new look at Mariupol. The landscape smouldering and battered. Meantime, Russia claims it hit a military arsenal in northwestern Ukraine with missiles launched from the sea. This missile fired off the coast of Crimea. The fighting was set to stop briefly in and around Luhansk to let people get out. Luhansk is in the disputed Donbass region of eastern Ukraine. Well, it's impossible to know right now just how many lives have been lost in this conflict so far. In one part of Ukraine, graves are being dug for soldiers who haven't even died yet. CNN's Ivan Watson takes us there.
This military cemetery is a reminder of how grim this conflict is. The authorities have dug dozens of additional graves, anticipating the likelihood of more casualties in this terrible conflict. This refrigerator truck represents another side of this war. It's partially filled with the bodies of some 350 Russian soldiers. There is another refrigerator truck, they say, that is parked in another part of the city with around 400 Russian corpses. And when you come to this side here, you can smell and to the families for proper burial. Ivan Watson, CNN, Dnipro, Ukraine.
Natasha Bertrand connecting us to Brussels now, and I want to get on the ground in Ukraine with Phil Black shortly. But this week couldn't be bigger as far as Europe, NATO, the Allies are concerned. It's, we've got two enormously high-stakes meetings. I guess the question that everybody really wants to understand at this point is, what do those present or those attending believe that they can achieve next? Because ultimately this is about ending this war. And yet we see no sign of that on the ground, do we?
We don't, Becky, and we also don't necessarily see concrete signs by NATO that they're willing to impose certain things on Ukraine, like a no-fly zone, for example, that Ukraine says is that tomorrow's discussion will primarily be about how the NATO alliance can defend itself. And of course, there will be talks surrounding how the NATO members can send weaponry into Ukraine and what kind of weapons the Ukrainians need in order to sustain their fight against the Russians. But ultimately, this meeting is going to be about how they can shore up those defenses on the eastern flank of NATO. And Jens Stoltenberg did say, he did preview some pretty significant things that could be agreed upon tomorrow, including major force increases on that eastern flank in eastern NATO countries, as well as providing them with additional defensive equipment such as surface-to-air missile systems, things that could allow the eastern flank countries to defend themselves if Russia did come dangerously close to their territory and even come into their territory with a missile attack, for example. So ultimately, this is going to be about reshaping NATO's, their defenses in the face of this brand new security environment. And, I did ask Jens Stoltenberg whether there would be any discussion of red lines here. What if Russia used a chemical weapons attack against Ukraine? What if they used weapons of mass destruction? And he would not go into that in detail, but he did say that any use of chemical weapons by Russia would have severe consequences. Take a listen.
Any use of chemical weapons would totally change the nature of the conflict. And it will be a blatant violation of international law and will have far-reaching consequences. And I think that's the most important message to convey, that any use of chemical weapons is absolutely unacceptable and will have far-reaching consequences.
So I think that's one of the biggest questions going into this is, will those red lines be discussed? And if Russia does cross some of those red lines that the U.S. and the international community have said are just flatly unacceptable, then what is NATO prepared to do about it? I think that's still very much an open question, Becky.
Here, Ukrainian forces are pushing back. I want to get to the action on the ground and bring in Phil Black at this point. Phil, in and around Kyiv, Russia's efforts to encircle the capital have been static for more than 2 weeks. In the last few days, Ukrainian forces have regained control of the town of Makariv and are putting growing pressure on forward Russian positions there in Bucha and Hostomel. Let me just bring up two other maps before I get to you. Elsewhere in the east, Russia's efforts to link up gains to the southeast of Kharkiv with territories that they have held since 2014 in Ukraine's Far East are focused on Izium. There are reports of Russian setbacks there. And in Kharkiv itself, the city has been massively damaged but not yet captured. And in the south, the area between Kherson and Mykolaiv remains a focus of Ukrainian counter-offensive, which has inflicted heavy losses on Ukrainian forces at the airport just north of Kherson. Phil, the story on the ground is mixed, isn't it? But let's be quite clear. This war is grinding on as we see and talk about this diplomatic effort to ratchet up action against Russia and continue to provide deterrence for NATO allies. That's all well and good. That's happening in Brussels. You're on the ground. We are seeing some wins, as it were, for Ukraine. What's the bottom line here? What's the bigger picture?
Yeah, I guess, Becky, on one hand, it is an extraordinary development in a way. It's not something that anyone was talking about 4 weeks ago when this war began. The idea of Ukraine not only defending fiercely, but actually rolling back Russian gains. And that is what they say is happening around, and particularly to the west, the northwest of the capital, Kyiv. And it's pretty significant because it does, at the very least, slow down Russia's efforts to get close to the capital and encircle it on that side. And if they can hold that ground, if they can consolidate those wins, perhaps push back Russia back further, then indeed their efforts to get the capital suffer further setbacks. And yes, there are talks, or there is talk, and we're hearing this from US defense officials, of further Ukrainian counterattacks in the east around Izium, as you touched on, and also in the south, Kherson, Mykolaiv as well. So for the Ukrainian side, undoubtedly this is positive, but even they are talking about this in fairly sober terms because they're aware of what the broader situation is. They're aware of the might of the invading force, and Russia is adapting too. When the fight up close isn't going so well for them, they are switching. Very much yet to come, Becky.
Phil Black is on the ground. Thank you, Phil. Well, Lithuania is among the countries that will be attending Thursday's high-stakes NATO summit. And the Prime Minister said in a recent speech, quoting now, Putin's aggression and Ukraine's pushback, stronger than many have expected, has shown the world that dictators are oftentimes giants with feet of clay. They are more vulnerable than they appear or they want to appear. Ingrida Šimonytė is the Lithuanian Prime Minister, and she joins me now live from the capital, Vilnius. We spoke before this war began. We hoped it wouldn't happen. We are speaking again now, 28 days in. What is your assessment of the last 28 days and where this is going?
Well, it is days of a very hard fight by Ukrainian people who are fighting not only for their sovereignty and territorial integrity, but also for the broader idea of liberal democracy and the right of the nations to decide their fate. And I think that it was everybody but Ukrainians who were quite surprised by the magnitude and by the strength of the nation to fight for their freedom and for their right to choose. And I was not that surprised because I know the spirit of people, but of course the level of devastation and the level of war crimes that have been committed by
Your president is heading to Brussels tomorrow for an exceptional NATO summit. What will his message be? And what is Lithuania hoping will be achieved this week? What's left to discuss?
Well, it's not like what is left to discuss, but what we must discuss. And I think one thing that we must discuss, we must be discussing that a couple of years ago, is how serious we are about the threat of Kremlin and what should be the NATO response to this. And of course, we've been discussing this after Crimea. There was some strengthening of the eastern NATO flank after Russia occupied Crimea and parts of eastern Ukraine, but that was definitely not enough. So was the sanctions. Of course, this is a debate for European Union Council more than to NATO countries. But nonetheless, I think this joint response by liberal democracies, by Western community, if I may call it.
Right. You've heard the NATO head, Jens Stoltenberg, echoing Joe Biden's position that the use of chemical weapons by the Russians would be completely unacceptable and the consequences would be far-reaching. Do you fear an attack?
Well, I think that everybody fears war and whatever use of weaponry. I think you cannot be less afraid of a regular war or the conventional war because it is something that should not happen, should not be happening first in the 21st century. So basically, this is just a level of escalation we are talking about, and a level of madness that one dictator can risk just to prove that what is happening in his head is something that has a right to live first instance. So I think the war against Ukraine was already a breach of international law, whatever rules you can imagine, and was a very significant change in so to say conventional wisdom that we were living in before, where the consensus was that Putin is good at bluffing, but he's not doing things. Yeah. Now we see that he's doing things. So should we underestimate or overestimate his threats? It's complicated to say because in a number of cases it proved us wrong.
NATO Secretary-General Stoltenberg says the alliance will double the number of deployed battle groups to send them to Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria and Slovakia. Is that enough from your assessment?
Well, I think the whole length of the eastern flank should be strengthened. Of course, it is for the military people first and to assess the military threats and the best means that should be used for the protection of particular regions in the flank. And then for politicians to follow the advice and agree on funds and headcount and equipment to be provided to the region, to the whole region, as a matter of fact. Because in current situation, when we see the war in Ukraine, the practical action on Ukrainian soil, of course, this is one thing, but I think we should not underestimate other changes that have happened throughout the period, namely the fact that Belarus has become to a large extent a province of Russia, because it is just rented the soil. Lukashenko just rented Belarusian soil for Russian attack, and the presence of Russian troops and military equipment on Belarusian ground is enormous and never seen, I think, since the Cold War.
Clearly, all of this will be discussed as NATO ministers meet in an extraordinary summit. We also have the EU, of course, meeting this week. A senior Lithuanian official telling Reuters that a planned summit between China and the European Union should be cancelled until Beijing shows whether it stands with Russia or the West over the conflict in Ukraine. Has the EU agreed to that, and is that something that you believe should happen?
Well, I think there are a couple of ways to see this. The other way is to see it as a clear opportunity to send the message to Chinese government about its position vis-a-vis Russian-Ukrainian war and Russian invasion in Ukraine. And now when the United States, United Kingdom, and all the Western countries have proved in accord with their other partners like Australia, Japan, and others, also in Indo-Pacific, that the reaction can be actually very swift and very strong, I think this message is also an important message to convey.
So you agree with it? You believe that China shouldn't be invited?
We can see it as a chance to convey this message in person.
Mm. It's good to have you on. Thank you very much indeed. It is an extremely busy week. It's an extremely busy time. I appreciate your time here on CNN. It's important for our viewers. Thank you. Well, the US president on his way to Europe for a high-stakes NATO summit in the midst of war. What can Joe Biden and other NATO leaders accomplish in Brussels? We'll talk about that with our chief international anchor, Cristiano Monpor, up next. Later, the effects of war are taking a heavy mental toll on those.
Living Gulf, in association with Gulf Saudi.
Dustin Johnson grew up in Columbia, South Carolina, barely an hour's drive from Augusta, dreaming that one day he'd earn a green jacket. In 2020, that dream became a reality.
It feels amazing. It's definitely, highlight of my career, and growing up so close to Augusta, it was just always that tournament where, as a kid on the putting green or, hitting chips, it was always to win the Masters.
Johnson will head to Augusta as one of the favourites again this year. But with competition expected to be as fierce as ever, can he add another Masters victory in April?
Yeah, of course. That's definitely the goal, is try to put on the green jacket again.
Living Gulf, in association with Gulf Saudi.
This is CNN. More people get their news from CNN than any other news source.
You can help the refugees from Ukraine. Join the over 70,000 impact. Click to take action.
Ukraine's president addressing two more governments today via video link. Japan's parliament earlier, and last out a speech to the French National Assembly. Volodymyr Zelensky receiving a standing ovation, again appealing for help.
Tomorrow it'll be 1 month that the Ukrainians have been fighting for their freedom. Our army has been fighting against the superior forces of Russia. We need help, more support, so that freedom is not lost.
Well, President Zelensky expected to appear by video at the emergency NATO summit in Brussels. US President Joe Biden on his way there now. Before leaving Washington, he told reporters the risk of Russia conducting chemical warfare in Ukraine is a real threat. Well, CNN's chief international anchor, Christiane Amanpour, joins me now from Brussels, where that NATO summit will be held on Thursday. And Joe Biden clearly trying to ensure a united front.
Well, yeah, and the big thing is that it is united, both the NATO alliance and also the EU alliance, along with the United States. The chemical weapons fear, the US has been putting that out with their warnings of the invasion, which Russia denied over and again. They're very concerned, as we know, that some kind of false tactic as Russia's ground operation is not going according to plan, at least according to what it appeared to be at the beginning. They have not taken Kyiv, they've not surrounded Kyiv, they've not taken, the leader from Kyiv, although now they deny that regime change was ever in their plan. They are getting very, very close to their goals in the south, and that is why Mariupol is being hammered, and it's a whole civilian infrastructure there that is being absolutely hammered. But if Russia seems to be in a corner, so goes the US thought, it might use something else like chemical, like they allowed their Syrian allies, Bashar Assad, to do in Syria during that war. And I spoke to the Russian president's spokesperson, as you know, Dmitry Peskov, and I asked him about the nuclear option that President Putin keeps in some way or another, raising. And he didn't rule it out or didn't rule it in, just said that we would never use it unless, we face an existential threat. But what constitutes an existential threat? Meantime, the NATO summit will be one in which all the allies reaffirm their unity, but also, according to the Secretary General, talk about sort of reposturing NATO, not just for this crisis in Ukraine, but for potential future crises, should, for instance, a hostile Russia come out of the Ukraine war with more expansionist aims. So I think you'll see a lot of talk about that and how to put more permanent NATO personnel and equipment in NATO countries surrounding, on Russia's western flank, so to speak.
So I think it's absolutely clear that Joe Biden is going to call for continued coordination and a unified response to Russia. I guess the question at this point is whether he will push allies to more directly confront Russia at this point. What's your sense?
Well, it's kind of unlikely, I think, given the way they've been talking about this up until now. I mean, it depends on what confront means, really, but they've ruled out any kind of military confrontation, any direct action, either on the ground or in the air by NATO, because they think that would actually put them and pit them against Russia, and that would then, in their view, make it more likely that the war would accelerate and escalate and expand. So they are not likely to do that. But what they really do want to do, and send an absolute message to Vladimir Putin so that he really does not miscalculate, is that, as they keep saying, and this is their phrase, not 1 inch. In other words, if 1 square inch of NATO territory was threatened by Russia, then all of NATO would enact Article 5 and go to war against Russia, to stop Russia. That's 30 nations against 1. So that is what they want to do. Now, I did speak to the EU Council President, Charles Michel, and he said, one of the issues here is that Vladimir Putin has been misreading and was mistaken about the way not just the Ukrainian resistance would show itself, but also what the West would do. Here, take a listen.
Probably they thought that the EU would be immediately divided and that we would not be able to take united decisions. This was also a mistake. Probably they would have thought that the United States and the EU, we would not be able to be exactly on the same page and to strengthen this alliance. It means that what's important, we must make sure that Putin will be defeated. It must be the common goal. This is a question of security for the future of Europe and for the future of the world.
So that is such an important statement. We must make sure that Putin is defeated for the security of Europe and the world. And we do know that, at least it's been announced, that elements of President Biden's promised new aid that he made, after President Zelensky addressed the Congress last week, that was some $800 million more dollars of lethal weaponry and other aid, including anti-tank missiles and the like. That has started to arrive, we're told, from Washington. So they are trying to build up Ukraine's resistance, its defenses, for as long as it's necessary.
Yeah, they must have real concerns about the humanitarian situation on the ground, as aid agencies say.
That's for sure.
The infrastructure is broken. I mean, inside there is real concern. Thank you. Well, they are...
Business is all about making connections. But some connections are easier to make than others. With a CNN partner hotel, the world is always at your fingertips. CNN partner hotels, connected to your world.
They've been coming across sniper fire, gunfire. You can see how. Arwa Damon, CNN.
I'm Bill Weir in Greenland, and this is CNN.
Well, we're getting word that a long-time member of Vladimir Putin's inner circle has left his post. The Russian state news agency TASS reporting that Anatoly Chubais stepped down as the government's point person on the environment. And Reuters says this resignation, a bit of a mystery, it has to be said. CNN's Nina Dos Santos is live from London to help us unravel it. And I know that you've interviewed Chubais a number of times in the past. We all remember his sort of rise to fame through the sort of late 1990s and 2000s. What's going on here? Who is he? And what's the significance of this departure, do you think?
Well, I think this is quite significant. It comes alongside other people who've risen to power during Vladimir Putin's time and also predated him during the last years of Boris Yeltsin's era as well, in the late 1990s. Government technology outfit in Moscow, and then was also the president of the Russian Chess Federation. We're seeing a few of these people starting to distance themselves from significant because he is somebody who spearheaded the market reforms from the Soviet era at the end of the 1990s towards obviously the market that we see in Russia at the moment. That meant plenty of privatizations. He was part of an influential group of economists through the early 2000s. Chubais at one point was leading the electricity monopoly to make sure that Russia got paid for its electricity bills. Then he spearheaded Rus Nano, which was the high-tech nanotechnology arm, before, of course, taking on this brief for sustainable and environmental causes, which he's now stepped down from. What's really interesting about this particular leak to a couple of news agencies, and also now confirmed by TASS, the official news agency in Russia as well, is that he appears to let it be known via sources close to him that he doesn't agree with what's going on in Ukraine, and he doesn't plan to go back to Russia. This comes just a few days after that rather menacing speech mid-last week by Vladimir Putin, where he said that people would figure out who the traitors were and spit them out like a fly that had accidentally...
clearly the sanctions against Vladimir Putin and his and the elite around him, these sanctions against Russian businesses, banks, this is all to put a squeeze on the infrastructure there, and the West would say encourage people to sort of break rank, as it were. It looks as if, to all intents and purposes, that is what Chubais has done. Just remind us briefly, you know, there is a core infrastructure, a core set of men around Vladimir Putin who remain in place.
Yeah, that's right. Although a lot of them are having their assets seized, and it's getting increasingly uncomfortable for them. When Russia's got, they're also politically frozen out of Vladimir Putin's orbit as well, because some of them may not agree with what's going on in Ukraine, but not all of them would have the temerity to actually voice it, like Anatoly Chubais, albeit through arm's distance, if you like, Becky. Again, as you said, that sort of vice-like grip on the Russian economy and on some of those oligarchs through sanctions is designed to try and precipitate exactly this type of behavior that we're seeing with people starting to break rank. It hasn't happened in large number yet, and a lot of people close to this orbit I've been speaking to over the last month or so have said it could take intermediaries, indicate they don't agree with what's going on. I should caution, though, that we don't really know where he is yet and where his assets are. So, obviously, people will be working the phones, including myself, to try and figure out whether we'll hear any more statements like this from some of his contemporaries who worked both for Boris Yeltsin and also for Vladimir Putin as well in the past. Becky?
Nina, thank you. Well, the more than 2 million refugees who have entered Poland from Ukraine, the World Health Organization says about 500,000 will need support from men.
It is those stories that grow more and more horrific, since what we're talking about is that the people who arrive at centres like this one that is sprung up, as it is from these besieged cities that they come, it is of course with worse and worse trauma that they arrive. I just want to give you an idea of this extraordinary humanitarian operation, Becky, that's been set up here within the space of first stop for the refugees as they arrive either at Przemysl station or at the land border crossing at Medica, not far away. They're put onto buses and brought, first of all, here, where they sleep. They can have food. There's hot food cooked for them. World Central Kitchen here doing that, preparing food. But it gives you an idea, first of all, of the precariousness of the setup, because it is in this location that they're kept for a few days and then taken on further. What's extraordinary is that this has been set up this quickly, where they can see this first shelter would have been some 80,000 people in the first few days of the war. Every single day they would have been arriving across the border, and then suddenly, and really that is the fear now. The coordination, or the lack of coordination, that there is, and that's been able to be created sufficiently quickly to ensure that the people who arrive here and are given immediate shelter and found some hot food and a hot drink and given a bed are then brought. Greater coordination of efforts has not yet taken place, simply because it takes structures like the European Union longer to organize themselves than it has taken ordinary people, NGOs, to step into that breach. And of course, as you said, what we're supporting people who are at the station to deal with some of that trauma that they're carrying and that they've been telling us about. These are profoundly vulnerable populations to begin with, since we're talking about women traveling with their small children, Becky, and they're coming longer term. Shelter for the beginning, not much more clarity beyond that.
Yeah, goodwill will only go so far, won't it, at this point? Thank you, Melissa Bell, on the critical story of those who are fleeing this horrible war. Well, as thousands upon thousands of people do flee the unspeakable violence in Ukraine, there are unmistakable reminders of how families have been torn apart by war, exhausting.
Tucked away in the back of the train station in Przemysl, Poland, we see the latest train from Ukraine arrive, filled with families, 2 sisters and their 3 children walking off the train. She's waited 3 excruciating weeks for this, and we have been waiting for them for a very long time. Tatiana also tells us they could not leave for a long time. The family tells us their journey to get to Poland was a path through death and destruction. Wanted to leave by car, was simply shot. We were afraid that if our family decided to leave, we would lose them. We waited a long time for the military to allow it. We waited for the Russian troops to be removed so that our family could leave, and we succeeded. We immediately told them to go. This was the escape route. The sisters' father drove them in his car. The area this family escaped has seen brutal warfare the last 3 weeks. Tatiana was in Poland working and couldn't return home in time when the war broke out. She says her. Finally, the family is reunited outside the train station. Przemysl, Poland.
Well, you're watching Connect the World. We're live from Abu Dhabi for you. Still a Taliban in the 1990s.
Do you know when trade is at its best? When it makes getting something, no matter how big or small, from one place to another, feel like handing it over with your own hands. And we make it happen thanks to thousands of great partners. For us, trade isn't about running ports. It's about opening portals.
Sex trafficking is happening in all hotels, in all brands, at all levels. My name is Lori Cohen. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of ECPAT USA in Brooklyn, New York. In our research, we recognize that so much of the child sex trafficking was happening in hotels because these were anonymous locations and traffickers felt that there was very low risk in being detected. In February of 2020, ECPAT USA partnered with Marriott International and with the American Hotel and Lodging Association to launch a free online training for people working in the hotel and hospitality industry. It was just before the pandemic, and we thought the timing was going to be terrible. But when we counted the numbers, 15 months into the pandemic, we were stunned to see that over 500,000 members of the hotel industry had taken the online training. And so even though it's an uncomfortable topic, there's a recognition that it's absolutely essential to protect children. It's the right thing to do, and it's also good for their bottom line.
Remember this scene? Well, it's one that is difficult to forget, isn't it? Thousands of Afghans stranded at the airport in Kabul, trying to leave the country after the Taliban's takeover last August. Well, the United Nations data shows more than on top of more than 3 million people displaced within the country because of years of fighting, just like what we are now seeing play out, unfortunately, in Ukraine. Well, Afghans who stayed behind are witnessing the withering away of human rights. This week, the Taliban postponed the return to school of girls above the 6th grade. Taliban news agency says the delay is so that uniforms can be designed according to Sharia and Afghan customs. Well, since their takeover in August last year, the Taliban have repeatedly insisted that they would not go back to how things were in the late 1990s and early 2000s, when women and girls were banned from going to school or going to work. This decision came just hours after schools were due to open. Many girls had arrived back only to find out they wouldn't be let inside. Listen.
We have rights. We are humans from this country. We want to be free. We just want to continue our education. Is it a sin that we are girls?
Pashtana Durrani and her family fled Afghanistan in the 1990s, and she was born a refugee in Pakistan. She later established Learn Afghanistan, an organisation that focuses on innovation in education and women's rights. And I'm absolutely delighted to say that you join me tonight live from Wellesley in Massachusetts. Thank you. These kids saying it's, the Taliban saying this is about uniforms, but what is really behind this postponement, do you believe?
Thank you, Becky, for having me. And the first thing we have to understand is the fact that it's just a political move. I think it's also the fact that once they started closing the schools because their own leadership is not uniform, they are just grabbing for whatever excuse they can find. And I think this was the least problematic and the most easy to find, so that they just went for the uniforms, because what is more easier than just to attack the uniforms or the school code.
As an educator yourself, how does this make you feel?
I find it absurd that they went for the uniforms, because there are provinces in Afghanistan where girls not only wear hijab but also burqa and then school uniforms to go to school. That's the first thing. And the school uniform is perfectly fine, because if it was not culturally contextual and not acceptable, people wouldn't be wearing it, and the girls wouldn't be wearing it for the past 2 decades or from the 80s and 70s to the schools. If that was acceptable back in the day, how is it not acceptable today? It's just an excuse and a political move.
So what sort of impact is this going to have on these young girls in Afghanistan? After all, the Taliban, it was August last year. I mean, we're not yet a year, but we're trundling towards a year in leadership there. What's the impact for these kids?
It's simple. A whole one academic year is just wasted for only girls from grade 7 till grade 12. There are schools that are closed in southern Afghanistan that were never even supposed to open. I knew this even a month ago, and we have been in talks about it with our administration and the schools and the staff members that we work with, that the schools were never intended to open in the southern region, and in regions that were supposed to open, and this is the excuse they come up with. This is just a political move. They want more attention just because of the Ukraine crisis. They are making a political move, and what's more easier to target than young girls, teenage girls?
Taliban leaders have repeatedly said they support women's rights to work and indeed to get educated. Do you trust them?
I mean, walk the talk. If they really support girls' education, open the schools, let the women work, let them be the first-class citizens that they are supposed to be, let them be Afghans that they are supposed to be. Why are they treated as if they are not Afghans and the Taliban are the sole owners of Afghanistan?
What happens next in the country?
A whole academic year is wasted, and I cannot stress on this enough. A whole academic year for girls have been wasted, and there is no solution in place. The international community is not looking for alternatives. They are just looking for the way to stand in solidarity with us. I don't want their solidarity. I don't want them to be standing up for us. They should be making sure that they avail spaces for alternative learning and learning spaces. Stop giving the Taliban the power that they don't have actually. They don't know how to run schools. Let the alternatives be the alternatives that could be accessed by the girls to get educated. And the next thing is to open schools for girls. That's the first and foremost need for girls. But if that's not possible, at least there should be a space that educates girls in the long run.
It's fantastic to have you on as we clearly continue to headline the story out of Ukraine. Does it worry you that what is going on in Afghanistan, which rightly stole the headlines back in August and in September of 2021, has sort of lost its power as a message?
I think one thing, it was expected of it, but then at the same time that when the world is not watching the human rights abuses that are happening in Afghanistan, the fact that schools are not open, that the international community's attention is not yet there, and the way it used to be is giving a free hand to the Taliban to pull any stunts that they want, because nobody's watching, nobody's listening, and nobody's keeping the record.
We're going to leave it there. We thank you very much indeed for making your time to talk to us this evening. It's good to have you on. Well, if you suddenly had to flee your home, what would you take with you? Well, for millions of people seeking safety in Ukraine, they had to think fast and take what matters most. We'll show you the things that they took with them. Up next.
Give these people a chance to escape the ferocious bombardment.
What do you tell a child?
No explanation for all of this destruction.
That is the uncertainty that so many refugees are now facing.
And it is
Mykolaiv.
In Lviv.
In Ukraine. This is CNN.
The very first Omega Speedmaster Professional was created in 1957, and it was really created for motorsports enthusiasts, but it became famous and continues to be famous as the watch that was certified for manned spaceflight by NASA.
3, 2, 1, liftoff. We have a liftoff.
A big part of the appeal is that there is no other watch that has the heritage of aerospace use that it has. It was used for the Gemini missions, it was used for the Apollo missions. It is to this day still the official watch used on the outside of the EVA suits that are provided by the Russian Space Agency for the folks up in the International Space Station. And you think about it, a watch from 1957 that was never designed for use in outer space, that has been used in manned space flight more or less continuously ever since the mid-1960s, there's just
says roughly 1 in 4 Ukrainians has been forced out of their homes by Russia's unprovoked invasion. Many had just moments to pack. My colleague Sam Abdelaziz asked some of the displaced people in Lviv what they took with them. Have a look at this.
Life changed in an instant for these families, forced to flee their homes as Russian troops invaded. But what do you take with you as you run? What is your most precious possession? For 11-year-old Victoria,
this is her favorite toy, is her bear.
It was mine and now it's hers, she tells me. When she's crying a lot, she cuddles him at night. Tatiana packed as the sound of explosions grew closer and closer to her family's home in Kyiv.
What is the most precious thing you took?
This is me and my father.
When I was gathering my stuff, I knew I needed to take this, she tells me. It's the only album with my dad's pictures in it. Her father died when she was 6, but pictures of his smile bring comfort. I knew the photo album would make me feel calmer. 7-year-old Milana rushes to grab her favorite thing. It's easy to see why she loves it. Because there are animals in it and dogs, and you can count, hear it sticks to leave his university dorm. But he knew what to grab. My sunglasses, I adore them, he tells me. They make me look cool like Kurt Cobain.
You feel now that you have the sunglasses on?
It makes me feel like everything is going to be fine, he says, that we will win, and I will walk on the streets of Kyiv under a peaceful sky again. A dream shared by the many victims of this senseless war. Sam Abdelaziz, CNN, Lviv.
Well, sports clubs in the Balkans are welcoming Ukrainians who've escaped from the war and are offering them another kind of refuge, a taste of normal life. A volleyball club in Bosnia and a tennis club in Bulgaria have welcomed the families of Ukrainian athletes. They're giving the refugees a chance to train, compete and live in safety.
I could not just be an indifferent spectator and watch what is going on TV from my couch as if I got the first call and responded immediately.
Well, for the athletes who fled their country, even a warm welcome hasn't made leaving Ukraine, of course, any easier.
We come to Bulgaria with the 2 families, and our fathers stay in Ukraine, our grandmothers.
Thank you for joining us. CNN's coverage continues after this.
The Profit Point, in association with Dan Gote.
So at Dalberg, we bring a gender lens to portfolio work in all sectors that we do. Another example I'd like to introduce, trying to understand how we can increase the production of the pharmaceutical product in Ghana. By doing so, we recognize that our interview respondents in the pharmaceutical sector manufacturer didn't have any female respondents. It was all male. By supporting a female field workers and the students to not just to study the medicine, but also business skill and getting into the manufacturing sector, we can address gender gap as well as we can address the production of the pharmaceutical product at the same time.
Have you been bitten by the bug of curiosity?
10-second trivia.
You get a perfect 10 out of 10.
All in 10 minutes. Stream at cnn.com/CNN10.
We live in such a fast-paced world where the news has been so relentless. Historic events have happened one after the other. I think that you need that daily appointment with viewers around the world to try and sort through the news of the day. What's important? Why does it matter to me? How do I put it all in context? We follow the news as it happens and where it happens. And then we also take a step back to walk the viewer through the day's news. That is the mission of Hala Garani tonight.
I'm Patrick Ottman in Havana, Cuba, and this is CNN.
This is CNN Breaking News.
Hello, I'm Linda Kincaid, live from CNN's World Headquarters here in Atlanta. Welcome to One World. Any use of chemical weapons by Moscow would totally change the nature of Russia's war on Ukraine. That warning from NATO's chief, who says the alliance will increase its forces in the region. Now, this comes ahead of tomorrow's emergency NATO summit. US President Joe Biden on his way to Brussels right now, where he'll join that meeting. Well, on the ground in Ukraine, Russian forces are striking homes, a shopping mall, and other buildings in Kyiv. Japanese lawmakers earlier and in the last few hours, the French. And this comes ahead of Volodymyr Zelensky's expected video appearance at that emergency NATO meeting tomorrow. Mr. Zelensky warned Japan's parliament about the dangers Ukraine faces from Russian attacks. Right now, the US president is on his way to Brussels ahead of crisis talks with fellow world leaders. On Thursday, Joe Biden will meet with NATO allies to discuss the ongoing response to Russia's first overseas trip since this invasion began last month. And the US is set to impose more sanctions this week on hundreds of members of Russia's parliament.
Well, what the president and during a military campaign that is not going his way. Vladimir Putin is not achieving his objectives. He's killing a lot of people, but he's not achieving his strategic objectives. And so as he gets more brutal in the conduct of the Russian forces, the specific things that the president wants to do on this trip are, one, talk about how to bolster on Vladimir Putin, and then third, to try to maintain the unity that has been so striking during this conflict. Russia was counting on the West dividing and being weak. He's gotten the opposite, and President Biden's trying to keep the pressure on.
Yeah, absolutely. That pressure greatly needed. Well, I want to go to Natasha because we are expected to see the alliance agree. What would mean if Russia deployed chemical weapons?
Yeah, Linda, so this is a question that we've been asking repeatedly is what are those red lines and what will NATO be prepared to do if Russia does cross those red lines? Of course, the international community has made it very clear that if Russia were to deploy weapons of mass destruction ability, then it would be a complete violation of international law and it would be completely unacceptable. So the question that we've been asking is, would NATO's position here change at all if Russia did deploy those kinds of weapons? And when I asked the NATO chief Jens Stoltenberg this question earlier today, he would not go into detail about what NATO would do in response to that, but he did say that the use of chemical weapons would totally change the nature of this war. Take a listen.
Any use of chemical weapons would totally change the nature of the conflict. And it will be a blatant violation of international law and will have far-reaching consequences. And I think that's the most important message to convey.
So what he also said, which was very interesting, is that allies tomorrow are expected to agree upon additional equipment being sent to Ukraine, additional weaponry and, of course, additional protective equipment that they intend to send to the Ukrainian forces and the Ukrainian people. And interestingly, that does include protective gear that can potentially shield them from chemical.
On Ukraine's demands, those demands including a no-fly zone across Ukraine, more fighter jets. Anything else we can expect to hear from the president?
I would not expect movement on those, Linda. The president has been very consistent in drawing a line beyond which he...
In D.C., Natasha Bertrand in Brussels. Good to have you both with us. Well, I want to take you back to the combat playing out across Ukraine right now and the places where it appears that Ukrainian forces are pushing back. In and around the capital, Russia's efforts to encircle Kyiv have been static for more than 2 weeks. In the last few days, Ukrainian forces say they have regained control of the town of Makariv, and they are putting pressure on Russian forces in Bucha and Hostomel. To the east, Russia's efforts to link up gains to the southeast of Kharkiv with territories they have held since 2014 in Ukraine's far east are focused on Izium. There are reports of Russian setbacks there. And in Kharkiv itself, the city has been massively damaged but has not yet been captured. In the south, the area between Kherson and Mykolaiv remains a focus of the Ukrainian counteroffensive. And this is where Ukrainians have been able to deal with punishing blows against Russian forces at the airport just north of Kherson. Well, CNN's Phil Black joins me now live from Lviv. So, Phil, it seems that the counteroffensive by the Ukrainians is impressive, despite coming up against a much bigger, more well-resourced Russian military. They are managing to reclaim some territory.
Yeah, it's an impressive turnaround, Linda. Fierce resistance has evolved down Russia's plans of encircling, moving into and eventually taking the capital. The key point, though, is the big if. Ukraine has to hold on to that ground. It has to consolidate those wins, perhaps even try and roll developments. It also does so in a fairly sober way because it knows the scale of the fight ahead. It knows the nature of the enemy and the firepower that they can firing munitions from a distance. Still often indiscriminately, sometimes in a targeted, precise way. But the Russian war machine has a great deal of firepower that it can. Small wins are important and they're certainly morale boosting, but they expect Russia to come back bigger and harder still. Linda.
And with that in mind, Phil, what else are the Ukrainians calling on? What else will help in their defense, given that the Russians say they haven't yet achieved their objectives and the U.S. has said that this won't end easily or rapidly?
Well, anything that will inflict pain on Russian forces, really. We know that they wanted a no-fly zone, and the Western allies aren't going to give them that. Instead, they've said, please give us whatever sophisticated anti-aircraft weaponry you can, preferably systems that we already know how to use. And in addition to that, any sort of advanced sophisticated weapons that will help them take the fight directly to Russian forces and continue to inflict pain. Because the Ukrainians are yes, they're trying to stop the Russians, but they only really have one way of ending this conflict, and it's been acknowledged by their Western allies as well. They have to inflict as much pain upon Russia as possible, so that when they do get around, can't get things all his way. And in order to achieve that, well, they've got to do a lot of fighting yet, because the Russians seem to have accepted that this is going to be a longer, slower war of attrition than perhaps they were planning for initially. But at the moment, they do still have the people and the firepower in order to be able to back up that sort of war. And so they are playing a longer game.
All right, Phil Black for us, live for us from Lviv, Ukraine. Good to have you with us. Stay safe. Well, coming up, from a lack of food and
With Bitcoin, not only do we have the best monetary asset in human history, we have the best monetary network in human history. Bitcoin solved a lot of the monetary functions that we know as very expensive with cryptography and with math. And so I can escrow a bearer instrument in Bitcoin. It's worth the same amount in Chicago as it is in London, as it is in Nigeria, as it is in Argentina, and over the Bitcoin network. So think about this. What if I wanted to send money from Chicago to London? What we can do is take dollars out of your bank account, turn it into Bitcoin, zip that value to London instantly and for free. You blink, you'd miss it. It goes so fast and it costs nothing. And then we turn it back into British pounds. That's the innovation, and that's how we use Bitcoin, the monetary network.
Welcome back. Well, Russia's invasion has forced 1 in every 4 Ukrainians to flee their homes. Take a look at this video from today of people making their way out of Ukraine and into Poland. Thousands of refugees have crossed into Romania. And now the Deputy Irish Prime Minister said that he expects Ireland to receive some 40,000 Ukrainian refugees by the end of next month. So far, some 2 million Ukrainians have arrived into Poland. The US president is expected to meet some refugees in Warsaw tomorrow. Just tell us what you've been seeing.
Well, that what can be done has been done, and it's been quite extraordinary to watch the response. Just to give you an idea of this disused